I had lived in this neighborhood for just over 2 years, and in that short time, I had already learned one very important truth. Never underestimate the chaos one entitled woman can cause when she thinks she runs the HOA. Her name was Karen, and believe me, she was the very definition of the term. She wasn't officially in charge of the HOA, but that didn't stop her from acting like she was queen of the cul-de-sac. If someone forgot to mow their lawn for 2 days, she would send a formal letter written in fancy language, claiming to represent the board. If someone parked on the street for more than a night, she'd plaster a fake violation notice on their windshield. And if you dared question her authority, she'd show up at your door with her phone camera out, filming, threatening to report you to the real HOA president, who, by the way, couldn't stand her either. When I moved in, I thought she was just a nosy neighbor. I didn't realize she was basically a self-appointed dictator of the block. The first time I met her, I was unloading boxes from the moving truck. She strutted over, clipboard in hand, wearing oversized sunglasses and that smug smirk of someone who thought the world owed her respect. She didn't even say hello, just, you'll need to submit your paint color for approval before you start on the house. I remember blinking at her, completely confused. I'm just moving in, I said. No plans to repaint anything yet. She gave me this look like I had just confessed to a crime. Well, she sniffed, just know that we have standards around here. I'll be keeping an eye on things. Then she walked off like she had just declared herself sheriff. For the first few months, I tried to stay polite. I'd wave when I saw her, answer her occasional emails about community cleanliness, and ignore the absurd rumors she spread about me not following HOA procedures. It was irritating but manageable. Until she decided to make me her personal target. It started small, a letter accusing me of leaving my trash cans out for an unacceptable duration. I timed it. I had brought them in 2 hours after pickup, which was well within HOA policy. Then came another notice about unapproved landscaping modifications. That one made me laugh because I hadn't touched my yard since moving in. But when I checked the letterhead, I realized something odd. The document had the HOA logo, but the signature at the bottom looked off. It was signed by President Karen M., Acting Authority. Acting Authority? Since when? I reached out to the actual HOA president, Mr. Daniels, a calm and level-headed guy who had been on the board for years. He nearly choked when I showed him the letter. This isn't from us, he said immediately. She's been warned before about pretending to issue official notices. I'll handle it. Apparently, this wasn't her first attempt at playing HOA enforcer. But what none of us knew at the time was that Karen had recently taken things to a whole new, illegal level. A few weeks later, I received what looked like a court summons in the mail. It said I was being fined and required to appear in a neighborhood arbitration hearing for repeated HOA violations. The document had seals, signatures, and even a fake docket number. My stomach dropped for a second, until I noticed the address listed for the hearing was actually Karen's own house. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just forging HOA notices anymore. She was forging court papers. I called Mr. Daniels right away. When he saw the papers, his eyes widened. This is serious, he said. She's committing fraud. I'm contacting the HOA attorney. He explained that only authorized legal bodies could issue such notices, and what she'd done crossed from being a nuisance to a criminal act. Apparently, other residents had also received similar summons letters accusing them of ridiculous things, one for having overly reflective windows, another for walking dogs on unapproved routes. She had been mailing these fake documents out for weeks, complete with bogus fines, hoping to intimidate everyone into obeying her. At first, the HOA tried to handle it quietly. They sent her a cease and desist letter, delivered formally by an attorney. But Karen? She doubled down. She claimed she was the one being targeted unfairly and even accused the HOA of corruption. Then she tried to back up her claims by fabricating even more documents, this time pretending to be from the county clerk's office. She printed fake seals and signatures, even going as far as to include a forged court order that supposedly validated her authority. It was unbelievable. That's when things escalated beyond neighborhood drama. Mr. Daniels took everything to the real county court, bringing along copies of all the forged papers. The judge reviewed them and immediately recognized they were fraudulent. He scheduled an official hearing, and Karen was ordered to appear in court to explain herself. When the notice was served to her, a real one this time, she tried to argue it was fake and that she didn't recognize the court's authority. She even told the officer delivering the papers that she was filing her own countersuit. The officer reportedly just sighed and said, "Ma'am, you'll need to take that up with the judge." The entire neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Everyone had dealt with Karen's antics in some way, but nobody expected it to go this far. Some neighbors even joked about bringing popcorn to the hearing. I'll admit, I was nervous but also curious to see what would happen. I'd be testifying as one of the people she'd sent forged documents to. It felt surreal, like something out of a comedy movie, except it was happening right next door. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. The courthouse was small but packed. Several neighbors came as witnesses. Karen showed up wearing a power suit, hair perfectly styled, holding a thick folder of papers she claimed were her evidence. She walked in like she owned the place. But the judge, an older man with a calm but firm presence, didn't look impressed. When he asked her to explain herself, she immediately launched into a dramatic speech about how the HOA was conspiring against her and how she was just enforcing community standards. The judge raised an eyebrow. "And these documents you issued, where did you get the authority to create them?" he asked. Karen confidently replied, "The homeowners gave me implied authority through collective consent." The courtroom fell silent for a second, and then the judge said dryly, "Implied authority is not a legal term, ma'am. You forged official documents. That's a felony." She blinked like she couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. "No, you don't understand," she insisted. "I was protecting property values." The judge leaned forward and said, "By impersonating the court?" That's when she finally began to realize the gravity of the situation. The HOA attorney presented side-by-side comparisons of the forged documents and legitimate court papers, highlighting the copied seals, mismatched fonts, and fake signatures. The judge's expression grew more severe with each page. Karen's confidence melted away like wax under a heat lamp. And then, just as the judge finished reviewing the evidence, he looked up and said the words that made the entire courtroom gasp. "Mrs. Karen M., you are hereby placed under arrest for forgery, fraud, and obstruction of justice." Her jaw dropped. She tried to protest, but two deputies were already stepping forward. "You can explain the rest to your lawyer," one of them said as they escorted her out. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, sealing her fate. And that was just the beginning. When Karen was escorted out of that courtroom, the tension in the air seemed to dissolve instantly. People who had been silently dreading her for months could finally breathe again. It was as though the dark cloud that had hung over our neighborhood had finally been lifted. I'll never forget the looks on everyone's faces, shock, disbelief, and then this collective sense of relief that justice had actually been served. After the hearing ended, a few of us gathered outside the courthouse. Mr. Daniels, the HOA president, looked utterly exhausted but satisfied. "Well," he said, letting out a breath, "that's one problem we won't be dealing with again anytime soon." The HOA attorney nodded beside him, still holding the evidence folder like it was a trophy. I asked him what would happen next, and he explained that Karen would likely face multiple charges: forgery, fraud, and filing false legal documents. Depending on the investigation, there might even be additional counts. Apparently, every time she sent one of those fake court notices, it counted as a separate offense. When you added them all up, she was looking at a serious penalty. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. By the time I got home that afternoon, everyone already knew. Neighbors were outside talking in small groups, shaking their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Turner from across the street even baked a batch of cookies and dropped them off, saying, "Well, honey, I think this calls for a celebration." I laughed for the first time in weeks. But despite the relief, there was still an undercurrent of disbelief. How had Karen convinced herself that she could get away with such a thing? Some people speculated that she had been power-hungry for so long that she just stopped recognizing any boundaries. Others thought maybe she truly believed she was in the right, that in her mind, the HOA had become her personal kingdom. Over the next few days, reporters began showing up in the area. It turned out that the story had caught local media attention. A headline ran in the county paper: "Suburban HOA member arrested for forging court documents against neighbors." The article described her actions in detail: how she had pretended to represent legal authorities and intimidated residents with fake notices. There was even a quote from Mr. Daniels confirming that she had been warned multiple times in the past. Some neighbors were nervous about having their names mentioned in the media, but most people were just glad the truth was finally out there. Karen had been tormenting people for so long that her downfall felt like poetic justice. A few days later, I got a call from the HOA office asking if I'd be willing to provide an official statement for the record. I agreed, of course. When I went in, the office was buzzing with activity. Stacks of files, laptops open, and people reviewing documents. They were working closely with the county's legal department to ensure everything was properly documented for the ongoing case. As I recounted my experience, the forged summons, the fake violations, and the intimidation tactics, the attorney nodded thoughtfully. "You're not the only one," he said. "We've received nearly 24 complaints from other homeowners. She targeted almost everyone on this street at least once." Hearing that made me realize just how widespread her scheme had been. She wasn't just trying to control her immediate surroundings. She was trying to build an illusion of authority across the entire HOA. In the following weeks, the community began to change. Without Karen's constant interference, people were more relaxed. Kids played outside again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months were chatting on their lawns. It felt like we'd all been living under her rule and were finally free. But there was still one loose thread: Karen's property. Her house sat at the corner of the street, big and over-decorated, with all those perfect lawn ornaments she used to brag about. After her arrest, it stood eerily quiet. The blinds were drawn, and her once spotless driveway started to gather leaves. A few weeks later, a for-sale sign went up in her yard, posted by a real estate agent. Rumor had it that she was selling it to cover her legal fees. One evening, I saw a moving truck pull up to her house. The crew worked quickly, loading boxes while a man in a suit, her lawyer, probably, supervised. I watched from my window as the last box was carried out. It had HOA files scribbled on the side in big letters. I couldn't help but chuckle. That woman really had taken her fake HOA career seriously. About a month later, the case went to trial. I was called to testify again. When I entered the courtroom this time, Karen looked different, smaller somehow. Gone was the arrogance and that icy confidence. She sat at the defendant's table, quietly flipping through papers, her wrists clasped nervously. Her lawyer did most of the talking now. During my testimony, I described everything that had happened: the fake summons, her reaction when confronted, and how she tried to claim she had implied authority. The prosecutor asked me how her actions affected me personally, and I told the truth. It made me feel unsafe in my own neighborhood. Every time I saw her car stop in front of my house, I wondered what she was going to pull next. When the judge asked her if she wanted to make a statement, she stood up and said, "I was only trying to protect our community." No one else was willing to enforce the rules. Her voice cracked halfway through, but even then, she couldn't fully admit wrongdoing. The judge sighed. "Protecting your community does not give you the right to impersonate legal authority," he said. "Your intentions do not erase the harm you caused." Her sentencing came a week later. The court ruled that Karen was guilty on multiple counts of document forgery, fraud, and falsifying legal materials. She was sentenced to community service, ordered to pay restitution to the victims, and given a suspended jail term with probation. She would also be permanently banned from serving on or even attending any HOA meetings in the county. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom was silent. Then I heard a quiet sigh of relief from somewhere behind me. Everyone knew it was fair. Afterward, I spoke briefly with Mr. Daniels in the parking lot. "You know," he said, "I think we all learned something from this. A little power in the wrong hands can do a lot of damage." He was right. What had started as a small neighborhood feud had turned into a full-blown criminal case, all because one woman believed she could twist the law to her own liking. Even months after her sentencing, traces of Karen's rules still lingered. Some people still hesitated to hang decorations or make small yard changes, afraid of another violation notice that would never come. But slowly, people began to trust again. The HOA even introduced new transparency rules to prevent anything like that from happening again. And as for me, I learned to recognize the warning signs early, the kind of person who hides control behind the word community. I started attending real HOA meetings, helping make sure things stayed fair and honest. Because if Karen had taught us anything, it was that silence gives power to the wrong people. The neighborhood eventually healed, laughter returning to the streets, children's bikes leaning against fences again. Life went back to normal, or maybe even better than before. The shadow of Karen's tyranny was finally gone, replaced by a genuine sense of unity. But sometimes when I pass by her old house and see the faint outline where her HOA compliance sign once hung, I can't help but smile. It's a reminder of how far we've come and how one forged paper led to real justice. Life after Karen's sentencing felt strangely peaceful, like the whole neighborhood had finally exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. 4 months, her presence had poisoned even the smallest daily routines. Every time someone mowed their lawn, repainted a fence, or parked slightly crooked, they did it nervously, waiting for a new notice from Karen's imaginary HOA office. Now all of that was over. At first, the silence felt almost eerie. No clipped footsteps echoing on the sidewalk at 6 a.m., no sharp knocks on doors followed by lectures about community standards, no long emails with subject lines like urgent, property aesthetic violation. But soon, that silence became something better. Tranquility. You could hear kids laughing again, dogs barking freely, and neighbors chatting over fences instead of whispering behind closed curtains. I'll admit, it took a while for some of us to adjust. For so long, we had all unconsciously lived under Karen's self-imposed rules. Even after she was gone, people would still ask things like, "Are we allowed to put up Halloween decorations?" Or, "Can I park my car on the curb for a day?" Mr. Daniels would just chuckle and say, "You can. The real HOA isn't here to boss you around. It's here to keep things fair." It was refreshing to finally see an HOA that acted like a community board instead of a mini-government. One of the first things the HOA did after Karen's departure was hold a community meeting. It was the first full meeting in over a year that wasn't clouded by drama. I decided to go, mostly out of curiosity. When I arrived, the small community hall was filled with neighbors, people who hadn't shown up in ages. Mr. Daniels stood at the front, calm and collected as always, and opened the meeting with a simple sentence that made everyone smile. "Let's rebuild our neighborhood, together this time." He introduced some new rules for transparency. All HOA decisions would be made publicly, recorded, and accessible online. No one could issue written warnings without board approval, and best of all, no one, under any circumstances, could claim unilateral authority again. It was a clear, permanent end to the reign of self-appointed rulers like Karen. After the meeting, people stayed behind just to talk. For once, it didn't feel like gossip. It felt like neighbors reconnecting. Mrs. Turner offered to start a community garden. The Johnsons volunteered to organize a summer barbecue. Even the Parkers, who had once been too afraid to speak out against Karen, signed up to help repaint the park benches. It was as if the neighborhood had come alive again. Still, Karen's story wasn't completely forgotten. Every now and then, a new resident would move in and ask about the strange rumors surrounding the HOA incident. Someone would inevitably tell them the story, usually ending it with a laugh and a piece of advice. "If you ever meet someone who acts like they own the place, run." One day, about 3 months after Karen's sentencing, I got a letter in the mail from the county clerk's office. For a second, my heart jumped. Old habits die hard, but this time, it was official. Inside was a thank you note from the district attorney's office, acknowledging the help of all the neighbors who came forward as witnesses. It included a small certificate of community contribution. It wasn't much, but it felt symbolic. We hadn't just survived Karen. We'd stood up for what was right. I decided to frame it and hang it in my hallway. Every time I walk past it, I remember that moment in court when the judge ordered her arrest. It wasn't just about punishing her. It was about setting a precedent that people like her couldn't bully others by pretending to be above the law. Around that time, Karen's house finally sold. The new owners were a young couple, friendly and down-to-earth. They introduced themselves right away, shaking hands and asking if there were any quirks about the neighborhood they should know. I almost laughed but instead said, "Just one rule. Don't try to start your own HOA." They laughed too, completely unaware of how close to the truth that joke was. As the weeks went by, their laughter and music filled the air that had once been filled with Karen's complaints. They painted the house a softer color, added flower boxes, and even hosted a small welcome barbecue for the whole street. It was the first time in years that everyone gathered together on that block for something joyful. We stood around the grill, chatting and laughing under the evening lights. Someone mentioned how strange it was to feel comfortable again. "It's like we're finally neighbors, not prisoners," one man said. I nodded, sipping my drink, thinking back to all those nights when I'd worry about what Karen might do next, if she'd send another forged letter or try another intimidation stunt. All that felt like a lifetime ago. As the evening went on, someone joked about making Karen bingo cards, each square with one of her old offenses: fake violation, court summons, lawn too long, unauthorized fence height. We all laughed until our sides hurt. For the first time, we could joke about it instead of feeling stressed. Still, beneath all the laughter, there was an unspoken understanding between us. What happened with Karen could have gone much worse. If nobody had questioned her, if Mr. Daniels hadn't taken the documents to the real court, who knows how long she might have kept manipulating people. She had nearly turned our quiet neighborhood into her own personal courtroom. Later that night, I took a slow walk down the street. The air was warm, the streetlights glowed softly, and the sound of crickets filled the space between houses. I stopped for a moment near Karen's old yard, now tidy, welcoming, and peaceful. The new owners had put up a small wooden sign near the garden that said, "Home is where kindness lives." I smiled to myself, thinking how perfectly that summed up what had changed here. After everything, the strangest part was how Karen had almost believed her own lies. During the trial, her lawyer had hinted that she truly thought she was acting in the neighborhood's best interest. But delusion doesn't erase damage. In her quest to control everything, she lost the one thing she wanted most: respect. In the months that followed, our community became something we were proud of again. We started a neighborhood newsletter filled with photos, announcements, and fun stories instead of warnings or complaints. We even held a small, clean slate day where everyone came out to repaint mailboxes, plant flowers, and share food. It was symbolic, a fresh start after years of tension. Every so often, I'd still catch someone telling a newcomer the legendary Karen story, usually in a mix of disbelief and amusement. It had become a sort of cautionary tale, what happens when ego meets authority unchecked. And every time I heard it retold, I couldn't help but feel a bit of gratitude. Not for what she did, but for what came after. Karen's downfall reminded us all that community isn't built on fear. It's built on respect, understanding, and fairness. And even though her actions caused chaos, they also forced everyone to come together in the end. In a weird way, she had united the neighborhood she tried to divide. Now, when I walk down the street and see neighbors waving to each other, kids drawing chalk art on the sidewalk, and dogs running freely without a single Karen shouting from behind the blinds, I can't help but smile. It took one fake court paper and a whole lot of drama to get here, but we finally got our peace back. Months passed, and life in the neighborhood truly found its rhythm again. The street that once echoed with Karen's angry lectures and power-tripping rants now felt alive with laughter, barbecues, and the hum of normal life. The fear that used to hover over everyone had faded into distant memory, replaced by the simple comfort of knowing that no one would ever try to rule over the rest of us again. But even after things calmed down, reminders of Karen's legacy still lingered here and there, small traces of her control that time hadn't completely erased yet. Every now and then, an old laminated HOA rule summary she'd taped to someone's door would blow across the street, yellowed by the sun and frayed at the corners. We'd laugh, pick it up, and toss it into the trash like a piece of history we didn't need anymore. One quiet Saturday morning, I was watering my front lawn when Mr. Daniels stopped by. He'd been re-elected as HOA president, this time by unanimous vote. He smiled and said, "Can you believe it's been almost a year since all that madness?" I chuckled. "Feels like a lifetime ago," I replied. He nodded thoughtfully. "You know, after Karen, the county introduced a policy to better regulate HOA authority. Apparently, our case made quite an impression at the courthouse. We were the example of what happens when someone abuses their power. That surprised me. I hadn't realized how far-reaching the whole ordeal had been. What started as a petty neighborhood dispute had actually sparked real change beyond our block. It felt strange, but in a good way. as if everything we endured had led to something meaningful. A few weeks later, I got a letter from the county again. At first, I hesitated to open it. Old habits die hard, but this time, it was an invitation. The local community committee was holding a small event to recognize citizens who had contributed to positive change in their neighborhoods. They wanted to honor our HOA board, and by extension, everyone who had come forward against Karen's fraudulent actions. The ceremony wasn't fancy, just a small gathering in a park with a few local officials, but it felt symbolic. Standing there under the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by my neighbors, I realized how much we'd all grown from this experience. Karen's scandal hadn't just exposed one person's lies, it had reminded everyone what real community meant. During the event, Mr. Daniels gave a short speech. "We learned that rules only work when they're built on honesty," he said, "and that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one that's right." The crowd clapped, and I saw a few people wiping away tears. Later that evening, after the event ended, a small group of us stayed behind to clean up. The park lights flickered on, and the sound of crickets filled the air. I sat on a bench, looking up at the stars, thinking about how everything had come full circle. Karen's downfall had been dramatic, yes, but in the end, it brought out the best in everyone else. People who barely spoke before were now close friends. The HOA, once a source of fear, had become a real community organization that people trusted. Even the kids, who used to avoid playing near Karen's house because she'd scold them for making too much noise, were now running freely through the streets again. Still, sometimes I caught myself wondering what had happened to Karen after the sentencing. Last anyone heard, she had moved to another town, far away. There were rumors that she was working quietly somewhere and keeping a very low profile. Part of me hoped she'd learned something from all of it, that she'd realized how wrong she'd been to try and control everyone. But knowing Karen, it was hard to imagine her ever fully admitting fault. She wasn't evil, just lost in her own obsession with order and control. Maybe she thought she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting the community from itself. But when control replaces compassion, even good intentions become destructive. One day, while cleaning out some old paperwork, I found one of her fake violation letters that I'd kept as evidence back then. The paper was stiff and official-looking, complete with her favorite phrases: "Immediate compliance required," and "Failure to respond may result in legal action." I couldn't help but laugh. What once made my blood boil now just looked like a piece of comic absurdity. I tore it in half, tossed it into the trash, and closed that chapter for good. As spring rolled around, our street organized a big neighborhood picnic, the first official one under the new HOA rules. Long tables were lined with food. Kids played tug-of-war, and laughter echoed through the air. Mr. Daniels even joked that it was the anti-Karen celebration. During the picnic, I found myself chatting with one of the newer neighbors, a woman named Lisa who had moved in just a few months ago. She said she'd heard bits of the Karen story from others and asked, "Was it really that bad?" I smiled and said, "Worse. But it taught us a lot." She tilted her head. "Like what?" "That sometimes," I said, "people use authority to hide insecurity. But if a community stands together, no one can bully everyone forever." She nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like you've got a pretty strong neighborhood now." "Yeah," I said with a grin. "We earned it." As the sun dipped below the horizon and lanterns flickered to life along the sidewalk, I looked around at the faces of my neighbors. People who had once lived in quiet fear but now laughed freely, openly, without hesitation. The very street that had once felt like a battlefield now looked like home again. Later that night, as I sat on my porch, I thought about how strange it was that one person's arrogance could bring so much turmoil, and yet, out of that chaos came unity, strength, and justice. It was almost poetic. I realized something else, too. In the end, Karen didn't really destroy the neighborhood. She tested it. She pushed it to its limits. And by standing up to her, by refusing to let lies and intimidation win, we'd built something stronger than before. So whenever someone new moves into the area, I tell them the same thing: welcome to the neighborhood. We've got a few rules, nothing crazy, just simple ones. Be kind. Respect others. And if anyone ever tries to act like they're the boss of the block, well, let's just say we've seen how that story ends. And then, without fail, I smile to myself because I know exactly what that story looks like. The fake notices, the forged papers, the courtroom drama, and the final moment when justice caught up to Karen. It all feels like a distant memory now. But every time I walk past the community board at the entrance to our neighborhood and see the sign that reads, fairness, transparency, togetherness, I remember why we fought back. We weren't just protecting our lawns, our mailboxes, or our fences. We were protecting something much bigger, the right to live in peace, free from fear, manipulation, and false authority. And maybe, just maybe somewhere out there, Karen finally learned that too. Because at the end of it all, she didn't just forge papers, she forged her own downfall.